Let's talk about Jesus, huh? So one day, Jesus preached this sermon that in 2021 would get him canceled. It would get him just like there'd be all the hashtags. It'd be a whole thing. Like articles would be written. Like half the country would be like, this is an outrage. And half the country would be like, how dare you cancel Jesus? And it would just be this whole thing. And then like all week I'd have to listen to people talk to me about it. And that would be it. Jesus preached a sermon exactly like that. And this is what it says. It's in Matthew chapter 5. It goes like this. Jesus says, you have heard the commandment that says you must not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. That is hardcore. That is a hardcore message. I mean, like, and more than that, Jesus is absolutely prescribing self-mutilation. Like, he's absolutely like, we're all worried about kids cutting themselves. And Jesus is like, yeah, just take your eye out. Just cut your hand off. Like, it's like, we're very, all this stuff. I mean, this is very crazy. This is over the top. This is just really just sort of a nutty thing. Not just Jesus, but like there's no Bible teacher or religious teacher that could get away with this language in the modern world at all. So I guess, in our world, a lot of times what happens is somebody will say something crazy when they're young. Like those tweets were when I was like 19. And so, maybe this is like Jesus's tweets when he was younger, right? This is only Matthew 5. There's, a lot of chapters in Matthew. There's like 28 of them. So like maybe Jesus settles down, right? So here's Jesus later on when he's had time to mellow out. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus ends up saying this. He says, and anyone who welcomes a little child like this on my behalf is welcoming me. Okay, good. We're welcoming children. Good job. But if you cause one of these little ones who trusts in me to fall into sin, it would be better for you to have a large millstone tied around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. What sorrow awaits the world because it tempts people to sin. Temptations are inevitable, but what sorrow awaits the person who does the tempting. So if your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better to enter eternal life with only one hand or one foot than to be thrown into eternal fire with both of your hands and feet. And if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better to enter eternal life with only one eye than to have two eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. Jesus is not mellowed out with time. In fact, he has added to his self-mutilation prescription murder, maybe? Suicide? I've always read it as suicide. I don't know, maybe like, I've always read it as like tie the millstone around your own neck. I don't know, maybe that's just me. It's I guess the language isn't super clear. Maybe he's referencing suicide. Maybe he's referencing just like murdering people. I don't know. But either way, we're drowning people with giant stones around their neck. So Jesus has not mellowed out. And that's on top of the self-mutilation. Which is probably why I've always read it as like a suicide thing, because he's, warning other people about doing things. So that's crazy language. Let's be honest. Let's be honest about this. This is crazy language. And let's just say this before we say anything else. Jesus is not being literal. Okay? And in fact, I don't think anyone ever questioned that. I mean, I think from time to time, in the modern church, guys, we are so bad about taking the Bible and saying, well, it has to be literal. Nobody ever did that before us. We're like the first, like the last couple of 100 years, we're the first people to just get really hung up on that. And in the ancient world, I know for a fact, 100%, that they didn't take this literally, and I can prove it. I can prove it. And here's how I can prove it. There were not a lot of one-eyed, one-handed people walking around. Like, no one listened to Jesus and was like, oh, better cut off my left hand. It's the stronger one. Like, it didn't happen. So we know they didn't take it seriously, and the reason, in part, that they didn't take it seriously is because this is absurd. This is ridiculous, okay? That's not like, okay, admittedly, we don't totally know how the afterlife works, because, I mean, we're in the before afterlife now. Like, we're in the life part of that now. And then, well, there's before life, and then there's this life, and then there's afterlife. Okay, so we're in the life part. We don't know what's going on over there. Like we don't know, but we do know this. At least we know for certain that no religious teacher has ever taught that like what happens physically in our bodies now like follows us in the next life. It's not like, I don't know, your house burns down, you get all like mangled in a house fire, and you're like, well, this is me for eternity. Like that's not the way that works. You know, it's not like you got like a disability and then like you're just disabled forever. You know, it's not like you just have like a really ugly face and like forever you're like, well, I hope there's no mirrors in heaven. Like that's not the way it works. Nobody, you know, the Bible actually specifically tells us that like we get a new body, like a glorified body, and Christ has a new body, and we have a new body, and all this stuff. So it's all new. That's the whole kind of the whole point of resurrection. So the idea of I need to gouge out my eye, and that way I go into, you know, eternity, the afterlife, whatever, with one eye, like that is patently, blatantly absurd. That's a joke, guys. This is Jesus making a really sort of dark joke. Jesus is joking about suicide. That's what he's doing. Jesus, I mean, he's wanting you to be a little uncomfortable, and he's wanting you to laugh a little bit as well at the notion of, you know, yeah, cut off your foot so that way forever you're hopping on one leg. So that's how Jesus teaches. I mean, there's no getting around this. It's hyperbole, it's exaggeration, it's like, you know, dark humor. The question is this: why does Jesus teach like this? And the answer is not that people back in the day were less sensitive. That is not the answer. Okay, remember a couple weeks ago, we talked about, no, that was last week. We talked about like that whole group of people that left Jesus because he gave this metaphor about like eating his flesh and drinking his blood, which was also a non-literal, you know, kind of a darkly humorous, you know, hyperbolic thing that he was saying. And like Jesus gives this phrase and like everybody leaves him. I mean, that's essentially getting canceled just in, you know, 30 AD instead of 2021. Like they all just left. They're just like, well, we're done with him, you know, forget this guy. And that's just what they did, right? So it's not that they were like less sensitive. Jesus was absolutely offending people on purpose, actually. He was doing that, you know, we wanted to make these points. And also there's the crucifixion thing. Like people were not fans of Jesus. We should always remember that. People did not take, I think a lot of times I've heard preachers be like, well, they just took it better back then. No, they killed him, okay? Like, didn't go well for Jesus either. So the question is, why does Jesus, knowing they're going to get offended, knowing they're not going to take it well, knowing that, like, he is signing his own death warrant, why does he use, like, metaphors and illustrations and jokes and hyperbole and all of that? Like, why is he doing that? And I think there's two answers to that we should understand. The first answer to that is very simply, it's memorable. I mean, if I tell you, like in both of these phrases, like the first one he's talking about committing adultery, right? Jesus could say, hey guys, don't commit adultery because adultery is bad. I mean, that's the point he's trying to make. Don't commit adultery. Adultery is bad. And then he's going on to say, well, it's not even just the physical act. Like when you look at a woman and you look at her like that, you are kind of violating her. Like you're violating, you know, who she is as a person. You're disrespecting her. You know, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's not who she is to you. That's not, you know, who you're supposed to be. Like it's this whole thing. Like Jesus, like he could have simply said, hey, don't do that. And he does say that. That is one way to say it. Or you can say, hey guys, it's such a terrible thing. It's such a violation of this person. It's such a violation of, you know, the relationship you're supposed to have with people that it would be better to cut off your own hand or cut out gouge out your own eye. Like it's the same point, guys. It's just one is really dramatically over the top, you know, something you remember, and one is just like, eh. You know, it's sort of like one is a bowl of Cheerios and one is a bowl of Cheerios with bananas on top. You know, like how good is Cheerios when you put bananas on them? And if you've never done that, you should, because it's really good. That's the difference, right? And it's the same thing. Like the second illustration, he's talking about kids. Like you don't want to tempt kids. You don't want to hurt kids. Like we talked about how in their culture, nobody cares about kids because like half of them die before they're 10. So nobody really gets attached to kids because you got a coin flip chance of being really disappointed if you are. And so they just like in that world, in the Roman Empire, in that whole situation, you don't care about children. And so Jesus is very, very sort of out there when he says that kids are super important. You should care about them. You should love them. You should protect them. You should not hurt them. And so, yeah, it's one thing to say, hey, don't hurt kids. But it's a whole other thing to say, like, if you're going to hurt a kid, you might as well be drowned in the sea by a millstone. It's the same, like it's Cheerios and Cheerios with bananas. Like it's just trying to give you that extra motivation to remember what he's saying. And so I think that's part of it. I think Jesus was, a good teacher. I think he was a good preacher, and I think you remembered what he said. Remember, we read in the Bible that people are like, nobody's ever talked like this. Nobody's ever looked at a crowd and preached a sermon. Nobody's ever talked to anybody like this. Jesus is completely unique in the way that he approaches things. So I think that's first of all. But I think the second thing is that Jesus was also doing something a little subtle here that we don't often think about, but we should. And that is Jesus is teaching us what sin is. So like we think about sin usually as stuff that hurts other people, right? Like if I lust after somebody or I commit adultery or, that whole thing. If I'm violating somebody else, I am violating them, right? That's what I am doing. They are the victims. But what Jesus is saying is like, hey, you might as well cut off your own hand or gouge out your own eye, cut off your foot, whatever it is, because what Jesus is trying to say is sin is also self-destructive. You never actually sin and just hurt somebody else, ever. It's not what happens. You don't sin and hurt somebody else only. Like, you sin and that hurts somebody else, but like, you also hurt yourself, always, 100% of the time. Every sin also is destructive to you, and that's the same thing with the millstone. Same thing. Like you can exclude children, you can hurt children and whatever, but like that's gonna destroy your soul. You can't do that and there's no getting away with sin, in other words. And so Jesus' illustrations are, hey, like, look, you don't want to, enter into hell with one foot or whatever, or it's better to enter into life with one foot than enter into hell with both feet, because Jesus is essentially saying, look, if you're living your life in sin, you're already in hell. You are already hurting yourself. You're already destroying who you are and what's going on. I mean, you're killing your soul. And so that's what Jesus is getting at, and he has this very clear thing. So when Jesus talks about sin, when he's trying to warn people off of sin, and that's what's going on here, these are warnings. When Jesus is trying to warn people off of sin, when the sin is maybe potential or theoretical or something that's coming down the road and might happen and may not happen because, you can say no to it, when that's what's going on with sin, Jesus is over the top. He's hyperbolic. He is really kind of crazy. He is, just absurd. It's sort of funny. It makes you uncomfortable because Jesus is trying to get the point across that sin is bad and it hurts you too. So don't do it. That's the end goal of all of Jesus' teaching is don't hurt your other people. Don't hurt yourself. Don't destroy this world and this life by sinning. Okay. So I bring all of that up. Because that's not the only way that Jesus addresses sin in the Bible. That's how Jesus addresses sin in the Bible in, his in his ministry, when, again, we're talking about sort of potential things that may happen, may not, all of that. That's how that happens. But you see, sometimes Jesus is talking to people who are already sinning or who already did sin. Sometimes Jesus is talking to people who this is not potential anymore. This is a whole thing. And as it turns out, an important thing we need to understand is that when that happens, Jesus addresses it entirely differently. So here's an example. One day, Jesus is preaching and he's teaching, and there's some people who come to listen to him, and they are tax collectors. They are sinners. They are people who, sort of notoriously sin. Like, they have chosen not just to sin like today or tomorrow, but they have chosen a lifestyle just an everyday, like their job is sin, right? So like they pay the bills by sinning. And that's what they are. So like they have chosen to hurt themselves, to hurt other people, and that's what they've done. And these people come listen to Jesus. And some religious leaders who don't like Jesus come out also to listen, because that's just what people do. Isn't it funny how people can hate something and then spend all their time obsessing over it? Like, I hate this thing, or I hate those people, or I hate that political party, and I'm just going to constantly talk about them. Like, man, people are funny. So the religious leaders did that, and they hate Jesus, but like every time he shows up to teach, they're like, better go listen to him so we can shake our fists. So they go and they listen to Jesus, and they're shaking their fists, and they see these people who are, the notorious sinners, the tax collectors, all of these people, and they are complaining. They're like, man, why is Jesus like this? Why is it that all these people are here, and these are terrible people. These are people that shouldn't be around. These are people that they're not respectable people. Why does Jesus let them hang out? And so Jesus, to them, also to the tax collectors and all that, but to these people who are sinning, okay, he tells a story. And it's really famous, and you probably heard it, but I'm going to tell it anyway because I really love the story, and so we're going to talk about it. But to the people who are in sin now, like currently sinning, not theoretical, not in the future, the people actually sinning, Jesus tells the story that goes like this. There was once a man who had 2 sons. And one of the sons decided he doesn't want to be a son anymore. He doesn't want the responsibility. He doesn't want the father. And so he goes to his father. He's like, hey, give me my inheritance so I can just take off, which is telling your father, I want you to be dead, and I also don't want to be part of this family anymore. So the father gives him what he asks for, because the father understands, like, my goal is for my son to be whole, right? And arguing with him now is not going to get that done. And fighting with him now is not going to get that done. And driving him away, in anger is not going to get that done. So I'm just going to give him what he wants, and we'll just see what happens. And so he gives him his inheritance. And the son goes off to, have fun. And he finds, because he's got a pocket full of money, that there is so much fun to be had. Like, there's all these friends, and there's all these ladies, and there's all this booze, and there's all these parties. I mean, he is just, everybody loves the guy with money in his pocket. Right up until the point that the money's gone. And now he's just a guy. And he's not a guy with money in his pocket. He's just the guy who's standing there. And suddenly the friends left, and the ladies left, and he can't afford to buy booze, and there's no more parties, and now he's just hungry. And around that time, he actually now, the world beyond him, there was this famine. And so, people are losing their jobs, and people can't really eat. And, he's a guy far from home. He doesn't know anybody. The people he knows don't care about him anymore. He doesn't have any money. He doesn't really have any, life skills, because all the life skills he had were wrapped up in being the son of this father, at this place. And so, he has nothing to do. And so the only job he can get is, the worst job in the world, where he's taking care of pigs. And if you're Jewish, you're not supposed to be around pigs at all, much less feed them and care for them and keep them alive. And I mean, so he's violating everything that his faith and religion and upbringing has ever taught him by feeding these pigs, right? And that's his job. That's the only way he can survive. And so one day, he's broke, he's destitute, he's friendless, just everything is awful. And so he thinks, man, I'll tell you what would be better than this life would be being a servant at my father's house. Because it's funny how people are. See, you hate something till you realize what you don't miss something till it's gone, right? So his dad that he didn't like is suddenly a real nice guy. And that life that he had, well, that's suddenly a pretty cool life now that he doesn't have it, and now that he's seen what life is like without it. And so he says, well, man, I burned the bridge with my dad. I told him he should be dead. I'm not going to go home and just everything's going to be okay, obviously. But I'm going to go home, and I'm going to see if he'll make me a slave, because a slave in my father's house is better than being free out here serving pigs and feeding pigs, in this famine, no money, no friends, no ladies, no booze. And so he goes home. And before he can even, give this proposal, this business arrangement to his father has been waiting. And he runs up the road to greet him. And he tries to be like, Dad, hey, Dad, I get, you're probably mad at me, so make me a slave. like he can barely even get those words out because his dad's got like a ring for his finger and a robe and like shoes, and like he's like party planning, like he's immediately the party planning committee, like get me the fattened calf, and like we're gonna have music and dancing and food, and like it's this whole thing. As it turns out, his son was very, very wrong, right? Because his dad loved him no matter what he had done and no matter how he had been. And no matter what he had squandered, like his father loved him, and everything that his father had was his. So that's the younger son's story. We haven't talked about the older son yet. But the older son, he enters the story now, because the older son, well, he hadn't asked his dad, for an inheritance. He hadn't told his dad he wishes he was dead. He hadn't any of that. Like he hadn't, spent, a whole inheritance on, nothing. He hadn't done that. He'd been staying home working, day in, day out, being a good son, working. Also, now he's doing 2 jobs because there were once 2 sons, but now there's just one. And so now he's doing like his job and also his kid brother's job. And so like he's just working, and he hears his party and he smells the fattened calf. And guys, I don't know that I've ever eaten a fattened calf, but I read this story of the Bible and all I want to do is eat a fattened calf. Like it just seems like it'd be like the best barbecue. Just the best like tri-tip cut off of that thing. I don't know. I don't know what a fattened calf is, I'll be honest. So, but I just imagine like it's amazing. And what's great about it is like the older son gets so mad. He's like, "Are you kidding? The fattened calf?" I mean, like clearly this is a really great meal. And so, he's like, "Dad," like he won't go in. He's livid. He's upset. And so, one of the servants goes and he gets the dad. He's like, "Hey, your other son is outside. He doesn't want to come in. Like now, like." Cool, you got a problem with your other son. And the father comes out, and he talks to the older son, and the older son's like, "Man, you never even killed a goat for me and my friends. Like, and now you killed the fattened calf, like the best animal you've got. You killed that for that dude who like squandered all your money. I have done nothing wrong. I work every day. I've been loyal. I've done 2 jobs, and you won't even kill a goat for me." I also want to eat goat meat in this, just for the record. I've never had goat, but I am given to the idea that lots of people around the world eat goat. I like to cook meat. I don't know if it's weird. Particularly like this is your first Sunday here, like added context. I like to. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. None of that is pertinent to the point. But like when I read about cooking in these stories, I just think, man, I wonder what that's like. So the father talks to the older son. He's like, "Look. You're not wrong about anything you're saying. Like, you're not wrong, man. And that's why everything I've always had is yours. Like, you've been a great son. I got no problems with you whatsoever. Like, everything's great. Good job. High five. Like, that's why all the stuff I've got is all yours. But also, your brother's my son too. And everything I got is his. And he was lost and now he's found, so we're going to celebrate." So that's a story that's real famous. And what I love about that story is there's enough room for everybody there. There's grace and mercy and compassion and kindness and love for everybody. The younger son, who's terrible in his own way, there's forgiveness and grace and mercy. And you know what? The older son, who's terrible in his own way, jealousy and, being all like bitter and petty and not loving his brother and not forgiving and, selfish. I mean, like he's not a great dude either. But there's compassion and mercy and grace and love for him too. And the point is this. No matter what we do, no matter how we sin, no matter how far we stray, no matter, what our particular favorite sin is, no matter how we hurt ourselves in our lives or hurt other people, there is always compassion and mercy and grace and love, forgiveness, no matter what you've done. Literally, no matter what you've done. And that's wonderful. And that's great. And when people are sinning, that's how Jesus teaches. So here we go. Before people sin, Jesus, over the top, hyperbole, going nuts, okay? Cut off your hand, telling jokes. Before people sin, Jesus is warning them, don't sin. But once they sin, all that's gone. Now it's invitation. It's kindness, grace. It's mercy. And by the way, this makes sense because Jesus is practical. Don't let anybody ever think that Jesus is anything like obviously Jesus is God in the flesh, so there's some like divine attributes, but like Jesus is pragmatic as all get out. For Jesus, he just wants the job to get done. And in this case, the job for humanity is reconciliation with God. Jesus wants us whole. He wants us safe. He doesn't want us hurt. He wants us to have life and have it abundantly. So, before we sin, it is warning bells. It is flashing lights. It is, do not enter. Don't do this. It's going to end terribly. But after the fact, that doesn't do any good. You've already done it. To talk like Jesus talks when he's warning people after people have sinned, that just beat them up. That would just make people feel bad for no reason. That doesn't help anybody. So instead, now it's kindness after the fact. Because the goal is always the same. For us to be whole. For us to be safe. For us to have life and have it abundantly. That's always the goal. And as an aside to the sermon, boy, do we get things messed up when we don't understand what Jesus is doing. Man, when we start just yelling at people because they sinned, I don't know if that has ever helped anyone, but I doubt it. Like, I've never met anybody that helped. You know, like, all that does is just, like, punish people. What are we doing? Like, it's like we haven't thought through what the end goal is, right? If the end goal is to make people feel terrible about themselves, then I guess good. If the end goal is to drive people away, okay, I guess good, because you did it. But if the end goal is reconciliation, you ain't doing that. And I bring all of this up because it turns out this is all a conversation about Judas. I haven't mentioned him yet, but this is all a conversation about Judas. So we're in our third week of our series called The Tragedy of Judas Iscariot. And the life of Judas is interesting. If you've missed the last couple of weeks, I would encourage you guys to catch up on those online. But if you missed the last couple of weeks, here's those two sermons in a nutshell. Okay, the first week we talked about how Judas was a good disciple. He was a good guy. He was absolutely like he had a ministry. He was friends with Jesus. Like, all of that was legitimate. All of that was sincere. All of that was great. But then something happened, and like he kind of just broke emotionally. And I think the reason that we sort of identified was his job as the treasurer of the disciples meant that he was the guy who always, gave money to the poor. And he starts, it sort of breaks him. He's seen like the hardest stuff in the world through feeding the poor and giving money to the poor, and he just sees so much brokenness. And he starts evaluating people not based on who they are as people, but on what their like relative value is. And by the end of that, at the end of 3 years of that, he looks at Jesus and says, well, Jesus isn't worth this stuff. Because that's how he thinks. He's not thinking in terms of people. He's thinking in terms of stuff and money and value and all of that. And that leads him to make a decision, which we talked about last week, that was based on a disagreement. Judas wanted Jesus to be something he wasn't. And Judas was normal, okay? Like the vast majority, like 90%, 95% of ancient Jewish people understood the Messiah as being this coming, conquering warrior who's going to, take over Rome and put Israel on the map and, destroy all the enemies of God's people. And that's what everybody wants Jesus to do. Like, over and over when you read in the Bible, like they want to make him king or, Palm Sunday, all that, with the palm branches. Like, all of that is them trying to, make Jesus the king who will violently overthrow all of God's enemies. And in John chapter 6, as Jesus first brings up Judas, it's in the context of people leaving Jesus because of the king thing. And so Judas is sort of attached by Jesus. He's associated with these people who want him to be an earthly king. And so in the end, Judas ends up changing teams because Jesus is simply not what he wants him to be. So all that's bad. All that's bad. And Jesus doesn't want him to do it. And it's not because Jesus doesn't want to go to the cross. As we've mentioned, If Judas never does what Judas does, Jesus still dies on the cross. Like, the religious leaders don't need Judas to arrest Jesus. Like, they're going to do it. They've already decided they're going to. And so Jesus doesn't want Judas to do this. And now that we've talked about what we've talked about, there's a really interesting passage in Matthew. Again in Matthew. This is what we read in Matthew chapter 26. Right at the end, right before Judas does what Judas does for the final time. This is what we read during the Last Supper. Jesus replied, "One of you who has just eaten from this bowl with me will betray me. The Son of Man must die as the Scriptures declared long ago. But how terrible it will be for the one who betrays him. It would be far better for that man if he had never been born." Man, I just found more hyperbolic language that's warning somebody not to sin. Because, look, there's no way that's literal. There's no way that, look, there's no reasonable, logical way we can believe in a God of love who makes people in his image, who says, yeah, but that guy never should have been born. Forget that guy. Don't like him. Like, no, that's not how God works, okay? Like, very obviously, that's not what we're talking about. What Jesus is doing is giving crazy hyperbolic language to try to warn Judas, man, you're hurting yourself. Like, you're not even hurting me at this point, because what's going to happen is going to happen. You're just hurting yourself, Judas. You don't want to do this. And Judas gets this, because you know who was present for all that cutting off the feet and hand thing? Judas. You know who was present for, the story of the prodigal son? Judas. Judas is there for all that. He's keenly aware. He is intimately familiar with the way Jesus teaches. He knows what Jesus is saying. Jesus is warning him, Judas, I want you to be whole. I want you to be safe. I want you to have life and have it abundantly. Don't do this, man. And Judas doesn't listen. And because this is the pattern. He warns, but then he gives grace once it happens. He warns, and he gives grace once it happens. He warns, he gives grace once it happens. Because that's the pattern, I believe with all of my heart. As much as I believe that God could save me, that he warned Judas, and he would have given grace once it happened. Had Judas come back and said, my bad. If Judas had there's no sin, there's no transgression that Jesus would be like, nah, not that one. When Jesus dies on the cross, it is for all people, it is for all sins, okay? Judas is a people, and Judas's sins are just sins. So he is under the umbrella of the all people and the all sins. Judas, there was grace for Judas. As much as there's grace for me, there was grace for Judas. Tragedy of Judas, then, is that I have no Bible verse to put up of him coming back. The tragedy is his ending, which, quite frankly, we don't really know what happened to Judas. We don't. The Bible actually tells us two very different things of what happened to Judas. So Matthew actually talks about how Judas, this whole thing happens, and then he freaks out because he realizes he's betrayed an innocent person. So he goes and he throws the money at the feet of the religious leaders, and he's like, Jesus is innocent, and I betrayed an innocent man. And the religious leaders just sort of laugh at him and say, well, that's your problem, not ours. And Judas gets really sad, and he goes away, and he hangs himself. And so then the religious leaders are like, well, we can't keep this money because this money paid for a murder, and you can't keep that in the temple. That's not the way God works. So, they gave the money, but they can't bring it back because, the murder. And so they said, well, we'll just buy this field, and they called it the Field of Blood because it was the blood money from Judas to Jesus. That's what Matthew says happened. And maybe that's what happened. I don't know. When Luke writes about it, another biblical writer, he writes very, very differently. He says actually that stuff didn't happen, but that actually Judas goes out and he buys the field himself with the money because it's his money. And then he's out on his field, doing field stuff, and he falls down and he breaks his neck and dies. And by the time somebody found him, all his guts were out. Well, maybe that happened. I don't know. I don't know. The early church was really fun. They looked at this and said, man, so we're just making up Judas stories? And so then they just made up Judas stories. Wait, Matthew and Luke have different things? Let's make up our own. And so then they had other ways that Judas died. And that goes on for 1,000 years. People are writing these stories. When I was in Bible college, there was great attempts to cram Matthew and Luke together, and like, oh, they don't conflict at all. Like, yeah, look, I'm not here to argue with anybody. What I'm here to say is this: it makes a lot of sense that we don't know exactly what happened to Judas, because there were no eyewitnesses, and that's the point. He was by himself. I mean, look, let's be real honest. What probably happened is they probably found a body. Probably found some, what happens to a body when it lays out for a while. They probably found a rope, and some people made some stories about it. I don't know. But bottom line is Judas dies alone in trauma and in hopelessness. Because he didn't understand or couldn't accept, or I don't even know, he couldn't come back to Christ who was gracious. The cross is for everybody and for every sin. And Judas, he just gave up. So here's our third week. Here's our third lesson. Like I said, this is all just kind of, the last 3 weeks were one giant sermon, essentially. I mean, we're talking about Judas. There's no point in just talking about Judas. Oh, that guy's terrible. Like, look, we can all be Judas. I can be Judas, especially when we consider some of the things that happened with him. This morning, we need to learn from the way that Jesus taught about sin that Judas couldn't do. Jesus warned about sin harshly. I mean, more harshly than he said anything. He warned us not to sin, because it breaks us. But then for the broken people, he offered unconditional mercy, unconditional grace, and unconditional love. Judas failed at both ends. To the end, Jesus was warning Judas, you really don't want to do this. And to the end, Judas couldn't accept these words from his friend of the way that God actually is. Because in his mind, he wanted God to send this conquering king who would murder a bunch of people. He didn't want grace and mercy. And so Judas's life ends in tragedy, alone. We don't know how he died exactly, but that makes sense. There's no witnesses. He was alone. I don't want that for me. I don't want that for us. So our final week, our final lesson, my prayer for myself, my prayer for you, my prayer for us all, is this third lesson from the tragedy of Judas Iscariot. May we all hear Christ's warnings about sin's self-destructiveness, and may we all accept Christ's grace and acceptance when we fail to heed those warnings. Let's say that again. May we all hear Christ's warnings about sin's self-destructiveness. And may we all accept Christ's grace and acceptance when we fail to heed those warnings. This morning, the musician is going to come forward. They're going to sing a song. We offer this invitation each and every week to take Christ up on his offer. The Bible teaches that when we accept that, we are to repent. It means to change. We want to turn our backs on who we used to be and be new people. And in baptism, that is a picture of that. In baptism, we align ourselves with Christ. Just as Christ was dead, buried, and raised, we ourselves are dead, buried, and raised, united with him in this life and in whatever comes next. If you've never made the decision, we got a nice, warm baptistry. Also, which people do it. Let's talk. If you're an immersed believer in Christ, looking for a perfect church home, this place is not it, but we do serve a perfect God. We want to connect, call, cultivate. We want to meet new people. We want to share the gospel. We want to grow up when we do it. And we want to learn from people like Judas. And we want to follow Christ as we heed his warnings about sin, as we accept his grace when we fail. As we stand.